The old Victorian house, with its peeling paint and perpetually groaning floorboards, had been the Davis family home for over 2 decades. To Alexandra, or Alex as she preferred, at 26, it was a comfortable, if slightly suffocating, cage. Graduating with a degree in computer science 4 years prior, she diligently secured a stable job as a software developer and, from her very first paycheck, started contributing $800 a month to her parents for rent. It was a fair deal, she thought, covering utilities, internet, and the general upkeep of the sprawling, aging house. Her younger sister, Sarah, 2 years her junior, had followed a similar path, albeit with a touch more flair. Graduating 2 years after Alex with a degree in marketing, Sarah had landed a job as a social media manager for a trendy boutique. Living the dream, she'd proclaimed theatrically, posting glamorous selfies from brunch spots and rooftop bars on her meticulously curated social media feed. Sarah had also moved back home after graduation, a fact that Alex hadn't given much thought to, assuming she was contributing to the household expenses just as she was. They were both adults, after all, with jobs and responsibilities. Or so she had believed. Alex was, by nature, a pragmatic and responsible person. She was the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who always followed through. Sarah, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of impulsive energy and dramatic pronouncements. Where Alex was methodical, Sarah was spontaneous. Where Alex was reserved, Sarah was flamboyant. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, recent immigrants who had built a life in this new country through hard work and sacrifice, seemed to favor Sarah's effervescence, often overlooking Alex's quiet diligence. It wasn't overt favoritism, but a subtle leaning, a slightly brighter smile directed at Sarah, a quicker forgiveness for her missteps, a general air of indulgence that hung around her like a perfume. Mr. Davis, a retired engineer, was a man of few words and firm opinions. He valued hard work, discipline, and respect for elders, values he'd instilled in his children, or so he thought. Mrs. Davis, a former nurse, was the more emotional of the two, her moods swinging between doting affection and sharp reprimands. She was the heart of the family, the keeper of traditions, the one who worried endlessly about everyone and everything. Both parents held deeply traditional views, often comparing their children to the respectful and obedient children back in their home country, a mythical land where, in their memories, children were paragons of filial piety. The house, despite its size, often felt cramped with unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. Alex tried to maintain a peaceful equilibrium, focusing on her work, her hobbies, coding and tinkering with electronics in the basement, and generally staying out of family dramas. She valued her independence, even within the confines of her childhood home, and her monthly rent payments were a symbol of that independence, a tangible contribution to the household, a way of pulling her weight. Last night had been unusually warm, the humid air clinging to everything like a damp cloth. Alex had been in her room, working on a personal coding project, the rhythmic clatter of her keyboard a familiar soundtrack to her evenings. The house was quiet, the usual evening murmur of television and family chatter absent. Then, she heard it, her parents' voices, raised and strained, drifting up from the living room below. She initially ignored it, assuming it was just another minor disagreement, the usual ebb and flow of family life. But the voices grew louder, more agitated, the words becoming clearer, sharper, laced with an undercurrent of anxiety that pricked at her attention. She paused her coding, headphones dangling around her neck, and strained to listen. She could hear snippets of conversation, fragmented phrases that painted a worrying picture. Bills piling up. Don't know how we'll manage. Credit card debt. Her parents were talking about money, and they were clearly stressed, deeply stressed. A knot of concern tightened in Alex's stomach. She wasn't privy to their finances, but she knew her parents were careful with money, frugal even. If they were this worried, it must be serious. She quietly slipped out of her room and crept towards the top of the stairs, peering down into the living room. Her parents were sitting on the worn floral sofa, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across their faces. Their expressions were grim, etched with worry and fatigue. Mr. Davis was running a hand through his thinning hair, a rare display of agitation. Mrs. Davis was clutching a tissue, her eyes red-rimmed. Alex hesitated for a moment, feeling like an eavesdropper, but the urgency in their voices compelled her to intervene. She cleared her throat softly, announcing her presence. Her parents looked up, startled, their faces a mixture of surprise and something akin to shame. "Alex? What are you doing up?" Mrs. Davis asked, quickly dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. I heard you talking," Alex said, feeling awkward and intrusive. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Davis sighed heavily, leaning back against the sofa cushions. "Not really, son," he said, his voice weary. "We're having some financial difficulties." Mrs. Davis elaborated, her voice trembling slightly. "The business has been slow lately," she explained, referring to the small convenience store they owned. "And some unexpected expenses have come up. The roof needs repairs, the car insurance went up." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken weight of their financial burden hanging heavy in the air. Alex felt a surge of sympathy for her parents. She knew they had poured their hearts and souls into their business, working long hours, sacrificing their own comforts to provide for their family. She wanted to help, to ease their burden in any way she could. An idea sparked in her mind, simple and practical. "I can help," Alex offered, stepping further into the living room. "I can pay more rent." Her parents looked at her, surprised. "More rent?" Mr. Davis repeated, his eyebrows furrowed. "Yes," Alex said, feeling a sense of purpose rising within her. "I know I'm already paying $800, but I can increase it. Maybe to $900, or even $1,000. That should help, right?" She gestured vaguely, feeling a little unsure of the exact figures, but confident in her ability to contribute more. "It covers utilities and everything anyway, so..." Her parents' faces softened, their expressions shifting from worry to gratitude. Mrs. Davis's eyes welled up again, but this time with tears of relief. "Oh, Alex," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That's so kind of you. That would really help us a lot." Mr. Davis nodded, a rare smile gracing his lips. "Yes, son, that's very generous of you. We appreciate that." He clapped Alex on the shoulder, a gesture of paternal affection that was also somewhat rare. "Thank you, Alex. Really." Alex felt a warm glow of satisfaction. She had helped her parents, eased their worries, contributed to the family in a meaningful way. She was a good daughter, a responsible adult, a pillar of support for her family. She basked in the glow of their gratitude, feeling a sense of quiet pride. Then, a casual, almost absent-minded question slipped from her lips, a question that would shatter the fragile peace and unravel the carefully constructed fabric of her family life. It was a question born of pure curiosity, a simple follow-up to the conversation, with no hidden agenda or malicious intent. "So," Alex said, still feeling the warmth of her parents' appreciation, "how much is Sarah paying?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet loaded, like a stray spark falling into a pool of gasoline. The atmosphere in the living room shifted instantly, the warmth dissipating, replaced by a sudden, chilling frost. Her parents' smiles vanished, their expressions hardening, their eyes flickering with a strange mixture of defensiveness and guilt. A long, agonizing pause stretched out, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The silence was thick, heavy, pregnant with unspoken truths and simmering resentments. Alex's brow furrowed, her initial sense of warmth fading, replaced by a growing unease. Why the silence? Why the sudden change in atmosphere? It was just a simple question, wasn't it? Finally, Mrs. Davis spoke, her voice tight and strained, barely above a whisper. "Nothing. One word. 4 letters." But it landed in the room like a bombshell, detonating the carefully constructed illusion of family fairness and equality. Alex stared at her mother, her mind struggling to process the simple, devastating word. "Nothing," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean, nothing?" Mr. Davis's face flushed crimson, his calm demeanor cracking, revealing the simmering anger beneath. "Your sister doesn't pay a darn thing," he exploded, his voice booming through the quiet house. The outburst, so rare from her usually reserved father, shocked Alex almost as much as the revelation itself. She recoiled slightly, her eyes widening in disbelief. She doesn't pay rent?" She stammered, her mind racing, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. "But I've been paying $800 a month for 4 years." Mr. Davis launched into a tirade, his anger spilling out in a torrent of accusations and justifications. "She just bought a brand new car, a fancy sports car. And then she didn't even pay the insurance. I had to pay for it. Out of my own pocket. She doesn't pay rent, she doesn't pay utilities, she doesn't pay for anything. She's been living here rent-free for 2 years while you've been paying us." His voice was rising with each word, fueled by a mixture of resentment towards Sarah and guilt towards Alex. Mrs. Davis chimed in, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and defensiveness. "She's just starting out, Alex. She needs to save money. It's harder for her in her industry. Marketing is not as stable as software development." Her justifications sounded weak, flimsy, even to her own ears, Alex suspected. Alex stood there, stunned, reeling from the double blow of the revelation and her parents' explosive reaction. She felt a cold wave of betrayal wash over her, a bitter taste of injustice rising in her throat. For 4 years, she had been diligently paying rent, contributing to the household, believing she was doing her part, being a responsible daughter. And all along, her sister had been living rent-free, enjoying the same comforts, the same privileges, without contributing a single penny. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle, the blatant unfairness of it all. She felt like a fool, a naive sucker who had been taken advantage of, not just by her sister, but by her own parents. The rest of the evening was a blur of anger, confusion, and recrimination. Later that night, after Sarah returned home from an evening out, oblivious to the simmering tension in the house, her parents called a family meeting in the living room. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations and barely suppressed rage. Sarah, initially radiating the carefree exuberance of someone who had just enjoyed a fun night, quickly sensed the shift in mood. Her smile faltered as she took in the tense faces of her parents and Alex, who sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her arms crossed, her expression grim. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with a hint of apprehension. Mr. Davis, his face still flushed, launched into a summary of the earlier conversation, laying bare the financial situation and the revelation of Sarah's rent-free existence. Sarah listened, her initial apprehension morphing into defensiveness, then outright defiance. "Rent?" Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Seriously? That's what this is about? I'm your daughter. Why would I pay rent to my own parents?" "Because Alex has been paying rent for years," Alex interjected, her voice sharp, cutting through Sarah's dismissive tone. "Because it's fair. Because we both live here and use the same resources." "Oh, please, Alex, don't be so dramatic," Sarah retorted, waving a dismissive hand. "You're such a tightwad. It's just money. And you make so much more than I do anyway." "That's not the point," Alex argued, her voice rising. "It's about fairness. It's about responsibility. It's about you taking advantage of Mom and Dad." "Taking advantage?" Sarah shrieked, her voice escalating. "I'm not taking advantage. I'm trying to save money. I just bought a new car, remember? And marketing jobs don't pay as much as your fancy tech job." Mrs. Davis tried to mediate, her voice strained and pleading. "Girls, please. Don't fight. We just need to figure out a fair solution." She turned to Sarah, her expression a mixture of exasperation and appeasement. "Sarah, maybe you could contribute something? Just a little bit?" Sarah reluctantly offered a paltry sum. "Fine," she huffed, crossing her arms and pouting. "I'll pay $100. But that's it. And only because you're making such a big deal out of it. Alex stared at her in disbelief. $100? She scoffed. That's a joke. I'm paying $800. And I was even offering to increase it. Mr. Davis, trying to salvage the situation, suggested a compromise. Maybe Sarah can pay $300. He offered tentatively. And Alex, you continue paying $800. $800? Sarah shrieked again. $300? Are you crazy? I'm not paying that much. That's ridiculous. No. Alex said firmly, cutting through the escalating argument. That's not fair. If I pay rent, she pays rent. And if we both pay rent, we pay the same amount. I'm not paying $800 while she pays $300, or $100, or nothing. The conversation devolved into a shouting match, fueled by years of simmering resentments and unspoken favoritism. Sarah became increasingly hysterical, her voice rising to a screech. Then, in a moment when her frustration reached its boiling point, she unleashed her final, explosive statement. Screw you. Sarah screamed, her face contorted with rage. I'm trying to live my life. With that pronouncement, she stormed out of the living room, slamming her bedroom door with a force that rattled the entire house. The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by Mrs. Davis's quiet sobs. Alex sat there, stunned and seething, the injustice of the situation burning in her gut. Her parents were left to pick up the pieces, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. Mrs. Davis was upset that everyone was angry at each other, wringing her hands and lamenting the family discord. Mr. Davis was angry that Sarah wouldn't pay rent and wouldn't move out, but equally unwilling to take any firm action, especially involving the police, a vague threat he'd muttered earlier. They seemed paralyzed, caught between their desire to appease Sarah and their need for financial stability. Finally, Alex stood up, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the emotional wreckage. I'm not going to pay any more rent, she declared, her gaze fixed on her parents. Not until Sarah does. It's only fair. Mrs. Davis looked at her, her eyes pleading. But Alex, she said, her voice trembling. We really need the money. That's too bad. Alex said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She turned and walked out of the living room, leaving her parents to wallow in the mess they had created. She retreated to her room, slamming the door shut behind her, the echo of Sarah's "screw you" and her mother's desperate plea ringing in her ears. The next morning, the confrontation escalated. Mr. Davis, emboldened by the morning light and perhaps a sense of paternal authority, came to Alex's room, knocking sharply on the door. Alex, who had barely slept, her mind churning with anger and resentment, reluctantly opened it. Mr. Davis stood there, his face stern, his voice accusatory. Your mother tells me you're refusing to pay rent, he said, his tone demanding. What is the meaning of this? It means exactly what I said last night, Alex replied, her voice cold and even. I'm not paying rent until Sarah does. Don't be ridiculous, Alex. Mr. Davis scoffed. You're being a jerk. You should pay rent because it's the right thing to do. It's your responsibility. Responsibility? Alex repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. What about Sarah's responsibility? Why is it my responsibility to pay rent while she lives here for free? Sarah is different, Mr. Davis said, his voice dismissive. She's just starting out. And you know how she is. She's not as responsible as you. So, because Sarah is irresponsible, I have to pay for her? Alex retorted, her anger simmering beneath the surface. That's your logic? Mrs. Davis appeared in the hallway, drawn by the raised voices. See? She said, turning to Alex, her voice sharp and accusatory. See what you've done? You've upset your father. You're making things worse. I'm making things worse? Alex exclaimed, incredulous. I'm making things worse? I'm the one who's been paying rent for 4 years while Sarah's been freeloading. I'm the one who offered to pay even more. And now I'm the jerk for asking for fairness? But we need the money, Alex. Mrs. Davis pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. We're already struggling. If you don't pay rent, we'll be in even bigger trouble. Well, maybe if Sarah paid her share, you wouldn't be struggling so much. Alex shot back, her anger finally erupting. Make Sarah pay rent. That's the solution. You've seen her. Mrs. Davis shrieked, her face contorted with rage. She won't listen to us. She's impossible. We can't make her do anything. Well, that's too bad. Alex yelled, mimicking her tone, her voice echoing through the hallway. Mrs. Davis's face turned a mottled red, her eyes blazing with fury. Well, we wouldn't have this problem if you didn't try to make your sister pay rent. She screamed, her voice cracking with anger. That was it. The final, absurd, illogical, infuriating straw. In that moment, something snapped within Alex. The years of quiet resentment, the subtle favoritism towards Sarah, the blatant unfairness of the rent situation, all coalesced into a burning rage. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to strike back, to lash out, to make them understand the depth of her anger and betrayal. Without another word, without a second thought, Alex slammed her bedroom door shut with all her might, the resounding bang shaking the walls and silencing her parents' tirade. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest, the echo of the slammed door reverberating in her ears, a small, inadequate expression of the storm raging within her. As she stood there, fuming, she could hear her parents' voices drifting from the living room, their familiar lament about their rotten children, how things were so much better back in the home country, how children used to respect their parents, how everything was going to hell in a handbasket. Their self-pitying monologue, completely devoid of any self-reflection or acknowledgement of their own role in the current mess, only fueled Alex's anger. She was done. Done with being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always played by the rules while Sarah and her parents danced to their own selfish tunes. She was done with being taken for granted, with being treated unfairly, with being blamed for problems she hadn't created. She was done with being the good daughter. A new feeling began to stir within her, replacing the helpless rage, a feeling of cold, calculating resolve. If they wanted a difficult child, she would show them what a difficult child could really do. If they wanted things to be like back in the home country, she would introduce them to a different kind of tradition, a tradition of justice, of fairness, of consequences. She wouldn't just withhold rent, that was too passive, too easily dismissed. She needed a plan, a real plan, a plan to make them understand, to make them regret, to make them pay for their blatant favoritism and injustice. She needed revenge. The seed of an idea began to sprout in her mind, slow at first, then growing rapidly, taking shape, solidifying into a concrete plan. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be easy, but it would be thorough, it would be effective, and it would be deeply, deliciously satisfying. Alex sat down at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard, not to write code this time, but to plot her revenge. The good daughter was dead. The game had changed. Her first step was to meticulously document everything. She opened a spreadsheet and began to meticulously record every single rent payment she had made over the past 4 years. She accessed her bank statements, painstakingly transcribing dates, amounts, and payment methods. She calculated the total sum she had paid, a staggering $38,400. Nearly $40,000 she had contributed to the household, while Sarah had contributed nothing. The stark number solidified her resolve, fueling her anger and strengthening her determination. Next, she researched average rental costs in their area. She scoured online real estate websites, comparing apartment sizes, locations, and amenities to their aging Victorian house. She factored in utilities, internet, and other household expenses. Her calculations revealed that even considering the size of the house, $800 a month was at the higher end of the market rate, especially for living with family. She had been overpaying, significantly overpaying, for years. And Sarah had been paying nothing. The injustice was even more galling in black and white, laid out in spreadsheets and data points. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, Alex moved on to the next phase of her plan, subtly sowing seeds of discord and discontent within the extended family. She knew her parents were deeply concerned about their reputation, about what their relatives thought of them. They were always boasting about their children's successes, exaggerating Sarah's flourishing marketing career and quietly taking credit for Alex's stable tech job. She decided to use this vanity against them. Over the next few weeks, Alex made it a point to casually chat with various relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, even her grandparents, during phone calls and family gatherings, which she attended with a forced smile and carefully crafted polite demeanor. She steered the conversations towards her living situation, mentioning how she was still living at home to help out her parents financially. She spoke of her rent payments, framing it as a responsible contribution to the household expenses. She never directly criticized Sarah, never explicitly complained about the unfairness, but she subtly implied it, letting the relatives draw their own conclusions. "Yes, I'm still at home," she'd say with a sigh. "Saving up for a down payment, you know how it is. But it's good to be able to help mom and dad with the bills. Rent in this area is crazy expensive, you know? I'm paying $800 a month, but it's worth it to support the family." She'd pause, letting the implication hang in the air, then casually add, "Sarah's doing well too, with her new job and her new car. She's really living the life." The subtle contrast, the unspoken comparison, was always there, just beneath the surface. Her relatives, initially oblivious, started to pick up on the subtle cues. They began asking questions, first politely, then with increasing curiosity and concern. "$800 a month rent to your parents?" her Aunt Margaret had asked, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "That seems like a lot, dear. Is Sarah paying rent too?" Alex would simply smile faintly and deflect the question, saying something vague like, "Oh, Sarah's situation is a bit different." She didn't need to say more, the seed of doubt had been planted. The whispers started, as Alex knew they would. Family gossip, especially in their close-knit immigrant community, spread like wildfire. Soon, her parents started noticing the change in tone from their relatives. The usual effusive praise and admiration were replaced by veiled questions, awkward silences, and thinly disguised disapproval. Her Aunt Margaret, normally a cheerful and chatty woman, became strangely quiet and reserved around Mrs. Davis, her smiles strained, her conversations curt. Her Uncle George, a blunt and outspoken man, even dared to ask Mr. Davis directly, "So, about this rent situation with Alex and Sarah, is everything fair?" Her parents, sensing the shift in family dynamics, became increasingly agitated and suspicious. They knew something was happening, something Alex was behind, but they couldn't quite put her finger on it. They started watching her more closely, scrutinizing her phone calls, eavesdropping on her conversations, their usual casual neglect replaced by an unsettling, watchful intensity. The tension in the house became palpable, a thick, suffocating atmosphere of suspicion and resentment. Sarah, oblivious as always, continued her carefree existence, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around her. She still paid no rent, still contributed nothing to the household expenses, still flaunted her new car and her glamorous lifestyle on social media. She remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm Alex was carefully orchestrating, a storm that would soon break and wash away the foundations of their carefully constructed family facade. The final stage of Alex's plan was set in motion when she received a letter from her landlord, a notice of rent increase for her own apartment, the one she had been secretly renting for the past few months, as a contingency plan, a safe haven, a place to escape to when her revenge was finally unleashed. The rent increase was significant, but Alex didn't mind. It was a small price to pay for her freedom, for her peace of mind, for the sweet taste of justice she was about to savor. She printed out the rent increase notice, along with her meticulously compiled spreadsheet of rent payments and the data on average rental costs in the area. She prepared a formal letter, outlining her grievances, her demands, and her ultimatum. She scheduled a family meeting, summoning her parents and Sarah to the living room, the same room where the initial confrontation had taken place, the room where the seeds of her revenge had been sown. This time, however, the power dynamics had shifted. Alex was no longer the passive, compliant daughter. She was in control. She was armed with facts, with evidence, with a plan. She was ready to confront them, to expose their hypocrisy, to demand justice, and to finally, definitively, break free. When they gathered in the living room that evening, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Her parents looked nervous, their faces etched with worry and apprehension. Sarah, however, still radiated her usual air of entitled indifference, lounging on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Alex stood before them, calm and composed, holding her documents in her hand. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady, devoid of emotion, but laced with an undercurrent of steel. "We are here tonight," Alex began, her gaze sweeping across their faces, "to discuss the issue of rent. As you know, for the past 4 years, I have been paying $800 a month in rent to live in this house. During that same period, Sarah has been living here rent-free." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching their reactions. Her parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Sarah finally looked up from her phone, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "I have compiled a detailed record of all my rent payments," Alex continued, holding up her spreadsheet. "Over the past 4 years, I have paid a total of $38,400 in rent. In addition, I have researched average rental costs in this area. Based on my findings, I have been consistently overpaying for rent, even considering the size of this house." She paused again, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Then, she turned her gaze directly to Sarah, her voice hardening. "Sarah, you have contributed nothing. You have lived here for 2 years, rent-free, while I have been subsidizing your lifestyle. This is not fair. This is not just. And it is not acceptable." Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, here we go again," she muttered, dismissively waving her hand. "Can we just get this over with? I said I'd pay $100, what more do you want?" $100 is an insult, Sarah," Alex said, her voice cold and sharp. "It's not even a token gesture. It's a slap in the face." She turned to her parents, her gaze unwavering. "Mom, Dad, you have allowed this to happen. You have condoned this unfairness. You have favored Sarah at my expense. And I am no longer going to tolerate it." She held up the rent increase notice. "I have received a rent increase notice for my own apartment," she said, her voice steady. "Yes, I have been renting an apartment. A place to go when I finally decided to leave this house, this unfair, toxic environment." Her parents gasped, their faces paling. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, her phone slipping from her grasp. "I am giving you an ultimatum," Alex continued, her voice firm and resolute. "Sarah will start paying fair rent, retroactive to the day she moved back in. She will reimburse me for half of the rent I have paid over the past 2 years, the period she has been living here rent-free. And she will apologize to me, sincerely, for taking advantage of me and for her entitled and disrespectful behavior." She paused, letting her demands hang in the air, watching their reactions. Her parents were speechless, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning realization. Sarah, however, erupted in fury. "Are you insane?" she shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Retroactive rent? Reimbursement? Apologize to you? You're out of your mind. I'm not paying you a single penny. And I'm definitely not apologizing." "Then you leave me no choice," Alex said calmly, her voice unwavering. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a set of keys, placing them on the coffee table. "These are the keys to the house. I am moving out. Tonight." She turned to her parents, her gaze piercing. And I will also be informing all our relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everyone, about the unfair treatment I have received in this family. I will tell them how Sarah has been living rent-free while I have been subsidizing her lifestyle. I will tell them how you have favored her at my expense. I will let them know the truth. Her parents' faces crumpled, their carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling before their eyes. They knew what this meant. Family disapproval, social ostracism, the shattering of their cherished reputation. It was their worst nightmare come true. Mrs. Davis burst into tears, her voice choked with despair. Alex, no. Don't do this. Please. We'll talk to Sarah. We'll make her pay rent. Just don't leave. And don't tell the family. Mr. Davis, his face ashen, finally found his voice, his tone pleading. Son, please, let's talk this over. We can work something out. Don't do anything rash. Alex stood firm, her gaze unwavering. It's too late for talk, she said, her voice cold and resolute. The time for talk was 2 years ago, when you first allowed Sarah to live here rent-free. The time for talk was last night, when you blamed me for asking for fairness. Now, it's time for action. And my action is to leave. And to expose the truth. She turned to Sarah, who was still fuming, her face red with rage. Sarah, she said, her voice laced with contempt. You can continue to live your life of entitlement and privilege. But you will do it without my money. And you will do it with the knowledge that everyone in our family knows the truth about you. Enjoy your life. With that, Alex turned and walked out of the living room, leaving her parents and sister to wallow in the wreckage of their unfairness and favoritism. She went to her room, packed her bags, and walked out of the house, leaving behind the groaning floorboards, the peeling paint, and the suffocating atmosphere of her childhood home. She walked towards her new apartment, towards her new life, towards her long-awaited freedom, feeling a sense of cathartic release, a deep, satisfying sense of justice finally served. The good daughter was gone. And in her place stood a woman who had finally learned to stand up for herself, to demand fairness, and to claim her own life on her own terms. The taste of revenge was indeed sweet, but the taste of freedom was even sweeter.